Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to Hot Mike. I'm your co-host, Bill Whittle. Hot Mike isn't here today. Obviously, there's no sense in sugarcoating it. Given the anxiety he's experienced about the upcoming election, he hasn't slept in 4 days. So the rest of the staff decided that in his best interest, we thought we'd put him in a medically induced coma until Thursday. So we expect him back by the end of the week. Well, everybody out there knows something big is happening, and it's not the election. It's something much bigger than the election. We're recording this on Monday, the day before the election, but what we're about to talk about is going to be just as relevant on Wednesday and Thursday and for the next several weeks, probably years, as it is today, the day before the election, again, as we record this. Something big is in motion, and it's changing all of the labels and all of the alliances and all of the different political factions. They're all getting so mixed up that none of it makes any sense anymore. The Teamsters Union is the definitive example of the Democratic base, or I should say the former Democratic base. It represents blue-collar, working-class men. And in the 2024 election cycle, the Democrat bedrock, blue-collar men, their union, the Teamsters Union, refused to endorse the Democrat Kamala Harris. Now pay attention, because so many of the rank and file Teamsters Union members were going to vote for the Republican billionaire. Let that sink in for a minute. The Republican billionaire is pulling Teamster, blue-collar, white working-class male votes in record numbers. It's an avalanche. That's a realignment. And it's not the only one. The former Republican vice president of the United States has endorsed the Democratic candidate. The former Democrat, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's the son of the Democrat crush dream candidate, has endorsed the Republican. The former Republican governor of California has endorsed the Democrat. And the former Democrat presidential candidate in 2020 has not only endorsed the Republican, she's become one. What do you make of all of this? What the hell is happening? What's going on out there? None of the labels make sense anymore. Liberals, who used to be the champions of free speech, the kind of the young and the hip and the groovy crowd, are now trying their very best to curtail free speech. They're a bunch of old, decrepit, rigid, fossilized dinosaurs that just want to tell other people what to do. Conservatives, on the other hand, who used to be kind of the yacht club, rich, curmudgeonly, stick-up-their-butt squares, now Republicans are the rebels. Now Republicans are the ones with the new ideas and the young bench and writing all the memes and having all the fun and the ones displaying a sense of humor. It's where the cool kids are now. But something fundamental is changing, and in order to understand it, I think we have to abandon the labels that we're used to. Abandon this Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal kind of branding and classification that we've been using my entire life, and look at things in an entirely different way. So that's what I decided to do. I think that this realignment means that this election is not about a Republican versus a Democrat. I think that the realignment is about whether or not we want to vote for an insider or an outsider. That's the way to look at American politics now. Insiders and outsiders. Those inside the Beltway, those elites who have been entrenching their position and becoming more and more isolated, more and more removed from the concerns of everyday people. These are the people who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, living in New York skyscrapers or in the Beverly Hills, and are the ones who say, oh, the economy's fine, all this stuff about inflation is completely overblown, don't worry about it, what are you complaining about? They're getting further and further and further inside this machine that is running the lives of the people on the outside of the machine. And the outsiders have had enough of it. And what we're seeing with these gigantic moves, almost all of them moving from insider towards outsider, by the way. The only people that are staying on the insider camp are rhinos, who are what I would call academic conservatives. They're conservatives who believe in conservative principles so long as those principles are being elucidated by them in their books and their lecture series and their websites and so on. The idea that common principles about common sense and government by the people is anathema to rhinos. That's why they're changing their endorsements and voting for Kamala Harris. They're insiders with an R next to their name. But it's not about Republicans and Democrats anymore. It's about insiders and outsiders. You can refer to it also as the people versus the elites. And that's what we're seeing here all across the country. That's how this election is going to break. It's going to break based on whether or not you think you're better at running your life than the government is versus those people that think that a giant state is the answer to your, not only to your governance, but to your personal life. The government's going to take care of your health care. The government's going to provide for your old age care. The government's going to pay off your student loans. The government's going to give you subsidies. The government's going to give you housing. All of that. It's people who believe in the state and the control of the state versus people who think that they should be left alone to run their own lives. That's the realignment. Now, I've been, as you probably know, if you've been watching for a while, I've been a big believer in this idea of the fourth turning, that there are 80-year cycles in American history, that our series that we're going to be doing as soon as we know which way this election's going to go, called Things to Come, is predicated on this idea that every 80 years there's an existential crisis in America. And the further away from that crisis you get, the stupider you become. The elevator pitch for this is that we fought the revolution, the first existential crisis in the history of this country, in the 1780s. If you add 80 years to the 1780s, you get the 1860s, which is the Civil War. And you add 80 years to the 1860s, you get the 1940s, which is World War II. And if you add 80 years to the 1940s, you get, well. So I decided to take a look at the last 80 years of presidential elections. That's 20 election cycles. And I decided that instead of looking at it as Republicans and Democrats, let's look at it in a different way. Let's look at it as insiders versus outsiders. Now, this is a judgment call on my part. I'm sure if you really want to split hairs, you can find lots of problems with this. But basically what I did was I took a look at the presidents that have been elected since 1944 and made a decision based not only on where they came from, but about their rhetoric, about how they behaved in office as president, and most especially about what their opinions seem to be about rule by the common people, about whether or not to let the outsiders into the machine. Let's start in 1944. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the consummate insider, rich family, governor of New York, political creature his entire life, come from a political family. Roosevelt, insider. Harry S. Truman, I consider him to be an outsider. Dwight Eisenhower was essentially begged into the office of the presidency. He didn't want it. I consider him to be an outsider as well. John Kennedy, on the other hand, comes from a long line of political families and has always been a part of the ruling class. So I'm listing Kennedy as an insider. Lyndon Johnson, who came from a dirt poor background, nevertheless was probably even more of an insider than FDR was. Lyndon Johnson was the master of manipulation of the Senate and clearly believed that the government was the answer to everything. So I'm calling Lyndon Johnson an insider as well. Richard Nixon was an insider who'd been in politics virtually all of his life. Jimmy Carter, on the other hand, was definitely an outsider. He was specifically plucked out of obscurity as a peanut farmer in Georgia because the nation was so sick of what the insiders had done to Washington and the country, as finally culminated in the Watergate scandal. Ronald Reagan is absolutely an outsider. Ronald Reagan clearly, from every single speech he gave, in fact, more importantly, in the years that he toured the country learning about America and learning how to be a conservative, inventing the Ronald Reagan that we knew, Ronald Reagan completely trusted the American people over the government. Ronald Reagan is clearly an outsider. George H.W. Bush, on the other hand, I consider to be an insider from a family that had been long inside the machine, working the machine, skull and bones, and all the rest of these things. These all factor into my snap decision about whether they're an insider or an outsider. Bill Clinton, who, like Jimmy Carter, was kind of plucked from obscurity as governor of Arkansas, nevertheless had wanted to be the president since he shook hands with John Kennedy as a boy, and I consider Bill Clinton, especially his role as president and the years after president, to be a man who helped make the modern political machine. He's clearly an insider. George W. Bush, who again is a sort of a out in the weeds kind of governor before he became president, clearly is part of the Washington insider machine. He's kind of the definitive rhino by today's definitions. I'm calling George W. Bush an insider. Barack Obama is not only a person who is comfortable with the machine. Barack Obama is a product of the machine. The machine created Barack Obama. Barack Obama is a government insider. There's no way that he's a populist on the side of the people. Then comes Donald Trump, who is the outsider of all outsiders. And then finally, we have Joe Biden, who's been in politics since, 700 AD or something along those lines, and is clearly an insider as well. So that's how I break them down. Now let's take a look at the whole picture here. Here are the presidents during the last 20 election cycles. That's the last 80 years. Here's their party affiliation. And you can see that it's more or less random. In fact, it's almost impossible to shuffle this more effectively. Republicans, Democrats, occasionally you get a little streak here and there. Occasionally you get a one-term president, but by and large, it's a pretty even distribution. And so if you look at the last 20 elections in terms of the old way of looking at things, Republicans versus Democrats, you don't see much of a pattern here. Just for curiosity, let's take a look at the origins of these last presidents, the last presidential cycles, last 20 cycles. You see what you would expect to see. The largest group is governors and vice presidents. So those two categories, governors and vice presidents, provide most of the background, most recent background of these particular candidates. There's a couple of senators in there. There's one general. We've had, I think, 5 generals that have been 5 or 6 generals that have gone directly to the White House. And the only one in the last 80 years was Dwight Eisenhower, and he was right pretty much at the beginning of the cycle. And then there's one person who hasn't had anything to do with the government whatsoever, and that would be Donald Trump. So now let's bring out this insider-outsider breakdown. Now, if we look at it as insiders and outsiders, we see all kinds of things that look a little interesting. First of all, let's divide the last 80 years into the first half and the second half. Technically speaking, the exact middle is halfway between Reagan's 2 terms. So we're going to say Reagan's second term is the dividing point. Everything before that is the first half. Everything after is the second half. If we look at the first half of the presidential cycles of the last 80 years, we see that insiders and outsiders are more or less equally mixed up, the same way that Republicans and Democrats are. But if you look at the second half of the last 80 years of presidential elections, you find nothing but insiders, with one exception. Look at this streak here. If Donald Trump had lost in 2016, it'd be a perfect streak. It'd be nothing but insiders for the last 40 years. What this tells me is that the political class in the United States has drifted so far away from the people that they're supposed to represent that they've become, for all intents and purposes, an aristocracy, and they behave like an aristocracy. People feel it. They feel it. When the lockdowns occurred and everybody was forced to stay indoors and not leave the house. Here in California, it was an extremely rigidly enforced lockdown. And we're all inside eating our mac and cheese. And Governor Gavin Newsom is sitting at the French Laundry restaurant, shoulder to shoulder with medical professionals, none of them wearing masks, indoors, which clearly indicates that this was not a real threat, because if it was, there's no way these very important people would be in the same room together, let alone unmasked. The whole thing was a gigantic, enormous play on the part of the aristocracy to show the proles and the peons and the peasants who's in charge and who's given the orders and who's taken them. Democrats have the hardest time understanding why Americans are voting for Donald Trump. And what they don't understand is we're not voting for Donald Trump. We're voting against you. We're voting against movie stars who feel like they can come out on these commercials and tell us who to vote for. Who do you think you are? Movie stars used to have some pull in this country. So did the mainstream media. But those days have gone. Nobody watches the Oscars anymore. Nobody cares. Nobody watches them. Nobody goes to the movies anymore. Nobody watches network TV. Why do you think mainstream media is so deep in the tank for Kamala Harris that they can pretend that this is an actual candidate that's actually qualified to run for president? They are on the inside. And they look at the fact that no matter how much they want to hold on to their power and their monopoly of telling people what to think, Joe Rogan, who's definitely not on the inside, pulls the kind of numbers that they would kill their grandparents for. If the insiders end up winning this election, by whatever means, this isn't going away. It simply means that the shift wasn't big enough in 2024 to have turned the tide. But nothing is going to reverse this tide. If it turns out that Kamala Harris wins the election, then the insiders will have their ultimate candidate, which is a nothing, which is a blank screen, an animatronic that they can use and stand backstage and have it say whatever they want it to say. Kamala Harris doesn't believe in anything. She does what she's told. She is the mouthpiece for the elitist ideology that considers themselves not only capable of ruling over all of us, but destined to do so. If the Democrats have lost working class men, and they haven't just lost a voting bloc. They've lost their brand. They've lost their soul. They were the party of the little guys. Now they're the party of movie stars and tech giants and people with $800 haircuts and media gatekeepers and a group of unnamed, unknown people that have been running the presidency for the last 4 years and want to run it for the next forever. They're not going to get away with it. Most of the people watching this video will watch it after the election. Sitting here on Monday, I don't know how it's going to go. I like where we sit now better than where they sit, but I don't know the answer to that. But I'll tell you what I do know. Whether or not this election goes to Trump or to Harris, this move from people no longer considering themselves to be Republicans or conservatives or anything, really just a question of it's inside the Beltway versus outside the Beltway. Is this country going to be run by we the people, or is it going to be run by the elites that have had a chokehold on the presidency for the last 40 years? That movement is unstoppable, and that should give all of us folks on the outside something to smile about, regardless of what happens on November 5th. I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time right here on Hot Mic.